Well, good evening, and I'm very grateful to the Green Party for sponsoring this event and also for the various citizens committees, and particularly Pat Lawson. What's going on there? Could you please turn off your cell phones? I have been asked to come here and just to explain to you a little bit connected with the Cameco plans to install a new circuit called the slightly enriched uranium circuit. And there is currently going forward an environmental assessment of this particular project. And there have been numerous requests made to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission from citizens of Port Hope to have a full public hearing on this proposal rather than just a screening. A screening process is one which is done mostly in-house, but it doesn't give the full scope of having an independent panel to listen to both the proponent and the people who have questions to ask the proponent, and all of this becoming a matter of public record. So a full panel review is what is being asked by many citizens groups here in Port Hope. What I would like to do is just to give you a little bit of background on this project and help you to understand what it's about. The Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility was founded in 1975, which happens to have been the year when Port Hope was very much in the news, because there was a discovery of a great deal of contamination around the town, radioactive contamination. The St. Mary's School had to be evacuated at that time. There were public meetings, there were headlines, and it was discovered that many properties were contaminated with radiation, and there was a lot of fear, naturally. Those events are in the past, and right now, I'm sure you're aware, there's a lot of money which has been allotted to try and clean up and correct some of these mistakes from the past. So there is now some resources available to try and do some corrective work. The Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility was formed because we felt that Canadian citizens deserve the right to understand what the issues are. Very often there's a kind of a secrecy or lack of transparency in the nuclear industry, which is compounded by the fact that the language that is used is often unintelligible to somebody who hasn't been trained in the field. And so we have tried to make educational materials available so that the ordinary citizen can understand better what these things are all about. Behind me, for example, is one of these educational tools. It's the Nuclear Map of Canada, which was put together by myself and my colleague Robert Del Tredici. Robert Del Tredici is one of the board members of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, and he is a photographer. He took these photos that are on the wall here, and he's an award-winning photographer, and he's also done photographs for many publications from the US Department of Energy. Some of his works have been purchased by the Canadian Heritage Society. The Nuclear Map of Canada simply shows all of the nuclear activities in Canada, starting with the mining, mostly now in Saskatchewan, although it used to take place in northern Ontario as well at Elliott Lake. And of course, these dotted lines represent what we call the Yellow Cake Road, which is the route that this uranium concentrate takes on its way to, first of all, the Blind River refinery, which is up on the north shore of Georgian Bay, where it's turned into a certain chemical form called a trioxide. And then it comes down to Port Hope to the Cameco refinery here and is manufactured into fuel for nuclear reactors, or hexafluoride, which is for export. And in fact, most of the uranium is exported. But about 20% of it is used here in Canada. I believe that's smaller now because we have fewer reactors operating. So now this map, there are on the table over there some copies of the Atomic Atlas project, and there is a copy of the map in there. And as you will see, on the back of the map, there is an explanation, a glossary, which explains what the icons mean, so that each icon has its own explanation there. And it's all part of what we call the nuclear fuel chain. It starts with uranium. It gets transformed chemically into fuel. It goes to the nuclear reactors in Toronto and Bruce, and also in Quebec at Gentilly. And of course, it goes overseas as well. And eventually it ends up as radioactive waste. So let me just simply quickly go through some of the steps in this fuel chain, and then I will explain how the SEU project, the new project here in Port Hope, is linked to what's going on in the nuclear fuel chain. So if you'll bear with me, I'll just call your attention to these photographs over here. The microphone won't quite stretch. So if you look on the far wall there, you see a picture of a child playing, children playing underneath a model of a uranium atom. That huge ball, that huge glass ball there with the child playing underneath is a model of the uranium atom. Uranium is a naturally occurring material. It's abundant in the Earth's crust, but in order to be able to mine it, you have to have a lot of it in one place in a relatively high concentration. And this is where uranium is mined. In northern Saskatchewan, there are some of the richest deposits in the entire world. Some of these deposits are so rich that they can't use humans to mine it. They have to use robots because the radiation is too high. It would be too damaging for humans to mine this ore. Now, next to the picture of the atom is a photograph. You see that kind of speckly photograph with a star shape in the upper middle part of the picture? That's the furthest photograph on the top. That's a picture of a slide of tissue taken from the lung of an ape. And what it shows is actual radiation, which is normally invisible. But this is a time-lapse photograph, and that star in the upper middle section of the photograph is actually the result of a tiny radioactive particle which has been lodged in the lung tissue, and it shows the tracks, the radioactive tracks, over a period of 48 hours. If you left the camera on for much longer than 48 hours, it would become so black that you wouldn't be able to see any tracks. All you'd see is a big black blob. So what happens is that when these radioactive materials, they are materials, and when these radioactive materials get into your body, they can emit bursts of energy. Now, some of these bursts of energy are very penetrating, and those are the ones that most people think about. When you say radiation, they think of it as like X-rays, something, a visible wave that goes right through you. Well, there are rays like that. They're called gamma rays. But there also are rays which have very short tracks, and that's what we see there. And this type of radiation is called alpha radiation primarily. Now, alpha radiation has such a short track that it only influences or damages the cells which are in the immediate vicinity of that radioactive particle. It doesn't damage any part of the body that's further away. But the difficulty is that that damage can be quite severe. And so that the cells which are damaged, if they're able to reproduce, they can develop into cancer cells, or they can also develop, in the case of other parts of the body, they can develop into genetic defects, which could be manifested later on, many, many years or even generations later on, in genetically defective children. It could also happen that the damage takes place to a developing embryo, and then you have an abnormal development. So these are the main effects of atomic radiation, the main effects that are documented. And these have been documented from an early age, from the early first decades of the 20th century, in fact. The production of cancer, the production of abnormal developments of children in the womb, which are called teratogenic effects. And then there's also genetic effects, which are different from teratogenic. Genetic effects are effects which damage your DNA molecules in your sperm or egg cells. And those can then be transmitted many years later to your children or grandchildren, and it may not be manifested for a few generations. So these are called genetic effects. Now, I would like to point out to you, and this is a very important thing, if you look at the history of how we found out about the harmful effects of radiation, it was generally not from the people who were pioneering the subject. You know, when people are thrilled with developing something, and nuclear science is a very interesting field, it's fascinating. In fact, when I was in college, I first wanted to go into nuclear chemistry or nuclear physics, because it is a very interesting field. But those people are much more interested in the technology and not so much interested in the unanticipated side effects. The unanticipated side effects are unfortunate, but not the primary interest. So the people who actually called attention to the medical effects of radiation were mostly people not in the nuclear industry, not physicists, not engineers, but medical people. For example, the way that the harmful effects of radium were discovered, radium is one of the byproducts of uranium. And you may know, perhaps, that the Port Hope refinery was originally built to produce radium. And that was back in the 30s, long before the first nuclear reactors were built. Radium was so valuable. At that time, it was $100,000 an ounce in the 1920s. Can you believe it? $100,000 a gram, which is even more valuable. $100,000 a gram. This is an amazingly valuable material. And at that time, it was the most precious commodity on Earth. And it was being used because of its radiant properties. And they were using it to paint dials of clocks and watches so that they would glow in the dark. But the women who did this, most of whom were very young women in their late teens, early 20s, in the prime of life, the women who painted them developed very serious medical complications. And the first one to call attention to them was a dentist who found that many of these young girls were coming to his office and their jaws were literally breaking. The teeth were becoming loose, terrible infections, and this was called radium jaw. And the only thing that these women had in common was the fact that they worked in the radium factory. Later on, some of these women developed bone cancer, which is a very rare form of cancer. And it became very clear that this was caused by minute amounts of radium which had got into their bodies and which had distributed throughout their entire skeletons. In fact, they found that when they did autopsies, they could take a bone from such a woman and leave it on a photographic plate overnight, and it would take its own picture. And even though the amount of radium in the body was too small to measure chemically, it was a very, very minute quantity, just a few micrograms, a microgram being a millionth of a gram. Nevertheless, this very tiny quantity had been distributed throughout the entire skeleton and did cause bone tumors, both cancerous and non-cancerous. Later on, these same women who survived that particular incident and didn't develop bone cancer, many years later they started developing head cancers. And the reason for that was because the radium in their bones was producing radon gas inside their body. And this radon gas was being transported by the blood, and it went to their head, and inside the head it caused head cancers. And all of this is very well documented. The main point I want to make to you, however, is this. All the way along in the history of the medical effects of radiation, it was never the case that the physicists and engineers led the way in showing what these harmful effects were. It was always medical professionals. It was people in the health sciences who found out that these medical effects existed. As recently as for example, in the 50s, in the late 50s, there was a medical doctor in Nova Scotia named Dr. Mackenzie, who was the first one to discover the connection between human breast cancer and radiation. And Dr. Mackenzie was simply studying women who had breast cancer, and he was tracing their histories, and he found out that the only thing they really had in common, many of these women, was that they had been irradiated. Their breasts had been irradiated with X-ray machines. I'm just talking about medical X-rays. And what he did was he was able to go back and get their medical records and find out how many medical X-rays they had, and he found a very strong correlation. And now it's acknowledged universally now that the human breast is one of the most radiosensitive organs in the human body. In other words, it's one of the most easily damaged. The second most easily damaged is the lung. And there are some organs are tougher. They're harder to damage. But these organs are particularly susceptible. There's a famous story of Alice Stewart in England, a medical doctor who discovered that just a single medical X-ray to the abdomen of a pregnant woman, especially in the second trimester of pregnancy, led to a 50% increase in the probability of childhood cancer and leukemia among these children that were subsequently born. So there is a vast literature on the medical effects of radiation, and we are always discovering new things about what these medical effects are. New things are coming to light all the time. So that by no means is it true that the last chapter has been written, especially when it comes to internal emitters. Those are the substances that go inside the body, because where they go in the body depends upon what they are. And what they are depends upon what kind of chemical they are. So the chemical properties determine where they go, and the radiation properties determine what kind of damage they do. So this is the situation. Now, I'll just rapidly mention these other pictures here. We have, on the far left, that's an interesting picture. You can take a look at it later. It's a sign being held by two native people from Delaney in the Northwest Territories, where the very first uranium mine in the entire world was built. And in fact, that's where El Dorado started getting into the radium business, was because of the discovery of that mine up there. And those native people are holding a sign which is a reproduction of a government document from Ottawa, from the Department of Mines, dated 1931, which is a warning to the workers in Ottawa that when they handle this material coming from the Northwest Territories, they have to be very careful, because even minute quantities can be harmful and can cause serious medical damage. Unfortunately, this information was never given to the native people who carried these sacks on their back, and they were even called coolies. They called themselves coolies, and they were called, because they were called coolies by the people who hired them. So they just carried this stuff on the back. They weren't even told to shower or anything. And now that village calls itself the Village of Widows, because so many men have died there. So there's lots of documentation about the harmful effects of radiation when it's not properly addressed and when people are not properly protected. It's a question of hygiene. It's a question of hygiene. You just don't want to be contaminating your environment with radioactive materials if you can help it. And so, you know, if you must, then by all means, take every precaution. And that's what the document there refers to. Now, let's see. We don't have a lot of time, so let me just fast forward here. After being processed, the uranium is put inside a reactor. Now, over on the left, in this series of 3 pictures here, we have the face of a CANDU reactor. That's actually the face of the Darlington reactor. You'll notice there's a man standing there in front of it. That's because the reactor has not yet started up. Once that reactor starts up, there will never be a man standing there again. And the reason why is because he'd be killed in short order by the radiation given off by the face of the reactor. What happens to the uranium when it goes inside the reactor is that the atoms themselves are split by a process called nuclear fission. And this creates hundreds of new substances that are not found in nature before nuclear power was developed. And these substances, we have 211 of them listed on our website, but that's not a complete list. The website is www.ccnr.org, and we have a lot of information there. We have a list of 211 of these materials, but that's not a complete list. Where do they come from? Well, when the uranium atoms are broken, they split, but the broken pieces are much more radioactive than the uranium itself. And in fact, the fuel bundle, it's about the size of a fireplace log. A fuel bundle, when it comes out of the reactor, is so radioactive that it would kill any human being unprotected at a meter's distance in 20 seconds. A lethal dose of radiation in about 20 seconds, just at a 1 meter's distance. So, and that's because it's literally millions of times more radioactive when it comes out than when it went in. And they call this used fuel or spent fuel, and it gives you the idea that, well, it's all used up, it's probably quite safe. On the contrary, it's extremely toxic and extremely dangerous at that point. And that's why there's all this fuss about what are we going to do with the nuclear waste. When they talk about the nuclear waste, that's what they're talking about, these high-level wastes mostly. But there are also the low-level wastes, and there is another picture over there on the other side of the column. You notice that ridge up against the sky? That's actually a wall of radioactive waste up at Elliott Lake. That particular wall is it's called the Sandrock Tailings Wall, and there's a road that goes up beside there. If you drive up on that road, you find out that behind that wall there's a whole lake of this stuff. There's altogether 70 million tons in that one lake. And what this is called low-level radioactive waste. This is radioactive waste left over from the uranium mining operation. But that will remain dangerous for hundreds of thousands of years, in fact. So it's quite dangerous, and that's another legacy of nuclear power. Now, the people who are in the nuclear business, they are very proud of the technology because it's a great technology. If you like machines, it's a wonderful machine. And if you like producing power in an efficient way It has lots to recommend it. You can understand how people get caught up in this. And the waste, well, they say, well, you know, waste is waste. You always have waste of some sort. It wasn't our intention to create waste. It's just an unwanted byproduct. But unfortunately, that unwanted byproduct has an awfully long lifetime, far longer than the pyramids of Egypt, far longer than the span of human history. And we don't quite know what to do with it. Now, let's now come to the point about where we're at right now. The makers of the Candu reactor have always prided themselves on the fact that the Candu reactor is, as they like to say, one of the best reactors in the world. And it has several features which are quite unique. It uses a substance called heavy water, which is not radioactive. Heavy water allows it to be very efficient. And in fact, by using heavy water, they are allowed to use what's called natural uranium. That's uranium essentially just as it comes out of the ground. Once it's purified and turned into the right chemical form, you can use it as fuel in these Candu reactors. Well, the Candu business, as you may know, is not doing very well. They haven't sold a single reactor in North America since 1978. And although they have sold some reactors overseas in Korea and China and Romania, they've had to make very large loans of money to do this. In some cases, they've lost money on the sales. And they are not able to sell as many as they have been wanting to because they promised Mr. Chrétien, when Mr. Chrétien was still Prime Minister, they would be selling one a year, and they have not been able to do this. So the nuclear industry is very much in need of getting some new blood, getting some new sales. And what they are doing right now is they are really at a turning point in their entire history. They basically said, let's kiss natural uranium goodbye because we're not making a go of it. We're not selling these things. We've got to go to what's called advanced fuel cycles. Now, if you look up advanced fuel cycles on the internet, you'll find out that advanced fuel cycles start with what's called SEU, slightly enriched uranium, but that's only the beginning. Slightly enriched uranium is one example of an advanced fuel cycle, but there's also something called recycled uranium, RU. Then there's something called DUPIC, which is, I won't bother explaining what all these things are. And there's something you may have heard of called MOX, which is using plutonium as a fuel. And they're even thinking about taking plutoniums from dismantled nuclear weapons and using those as a fuel. Now, here's where you guys come in. This is Port Hope. Port Hope has one of the few plants in the world that can do this uranium conversion work. There's only 4 in North America. And this is the only one, as far as I know, that is situated so close to a downtown area, right on a prime waterfront location. And in most other cases, you know, they are isolated. They have a very large exclusion zone around them where people are not allowed to live or to go or to grow. And it's rather a different situation. So what happens is that now they want to bite the bullet and they want to start using slightly enriched uranium. And that's just the beginning, because it means that they're now launching into what's called advanced fuel cycles. In a few years' time, they may be making fuels from plutonium. If they had their way, that is, if they're able to sell some reactors and get some business going. Already they're testing a plutonium fuel bundle up at Chalk River. It's been tested there already for 3 years. And once those tests are finished, which is just about now, by the way, they're going to be making a pitch to try and go ahead and start using plutonium as a fuel. Now, what does this mean to Port Hope? Well, to Port Hope, it means that you are on the cutting edge as well. It means that you are really right there at the crossroads. Because if this is the path that the Canadian nuclear industry is going to take, then it's up to Port Hope to decide whether they want to continue having this facility right there on the waterfront, right close to downtown. Why? Because these fuels are different. Natural uranium fuels do have their dangers, and we know that. We know from the mining populations in Canada. Every mining population has shown excess incidences of lung cancer. We know about radon gas and about the dangers of it, and universally acknowledged as being the second leading cause of lung cancer, and as being one of the most potent carcinogens on Earth, radon. And by the way, every atom of radon comes from uranium. It's a byproduct of uranium. So every single atom of radon comes from an atom of uranium. So now, once you start using these advanced fuel cycles, the trouble is you have new problems that you didn't have before. First of all, the fuels themselves are much more toxic. For example, even slightly enriched uranium, if you talk about, they're talking about importing 5% uranium as a feedstock and then blending it down to about 1%. I won't bother at this moment explaining what enriched uranium is, but if you'd like to know, I'll talk to you later. Enriched uranium is something you have to import, because here in Canada we do not have the ability to enrich uranium. So we're talking about importing uranium from other countries, which has been enriched. It might have come from Canada originally, but it has to go somewhere else to be enriched. Then it would come back here. When it comes back here, it's at least 3 to 5 times more radiotoxic than the natural uranium. That means that whatever emissions come out of the plant are more toxic. They're more dangerous. The second thing is that you have the possibility of accidents which did not exist before. And these are called criticality accidents. Now, just for the sake of argument, I'd just like to ask you, who knows what criticality means? Well, there you have it, you see? Not too many. This is the kind of thing that makes it so hard for ordinary citizens to come to grips with these issues, because there's not proper education done as to what these things mean. Criticality has to do with the fact that when the uranium is enriched, then just by wetting it, just by getting it wet, if you have enough of this stuff and it gets wet and it's in a bad geometry, as they call it, then it can undergo a spontaneous nuclear reaction without even having a nuclear reactor. In other words, it can start reacting, splitting those atoms and producing those byproducts that I was talking about in small quantities, and giving off a burst of very dangerous things called neutrons. Neutron radiation is even more damaging than alpha radiation and much more penetrating. So the criticality accidents, although they are not expected to happen, I mean, it's not something you plan on having, nevertheless, it's a risk that didn't exist before, that now you're living in that possibility. With slightly enriched uranium, to be perfectly honest, the risk is likewise very slight of having such an accident. But as you step up the chain towards using plutonium and so on, the risk gets much greater. And so these criticality accidents become an increasing and growing risk. The third thing is, what was the third thing? Oh, yes. I'm sorry. The third thing is physical security. Unfortunately, when you start dealing with these materials, you really start having to worry about, as far-fetched as it sounds, you have to start worrying about terrorists, you have to start worrying about sabotage, you have to start worrying about malicious acts from people who want to get their hands on some of this material. Now, that's particularly the case when you go all the way up to plutonium, because plutonium is the raw material for bombs. And people who can steal plutonium can make a crude nuclear bomb from it, which is quite powerful, about 1/3 the explosive power of the Hiroshima bomb, just a homemade device. What happens then is that you have a security problem of an almost paramilitary nature. Not immediately, not immediately, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that this is going to be the case with the slightly enriched uranium project itself. But once you start embarking on those advanced fuel cycles, that's the direction you're moving in. And in fact, increased security is a major concern in the environmental assessment for this SEU project. How's my time? I'm doing okay? 5, 7 minutes. Okay. All right. Now, here's what I would like to put forward as, there's basically 2 ways you could approach this. One way to approach it is say, well, you know, Cameco has been good to this town, they've given us jobs, they've given us a certain amount of prosperity and so on, so, you know, we'll trust them and we'll trust that they'll do the best they can, et cetera, despite the fact that there has been a lot of mistakes in the past, despite the fact that there has been a lot of very unfortunate contamination and probably a lot of unrecorded health damage as a result of this. Because who is looking? Who is actually taking the measurements? It doesn't seem that the Nuclear Safety Commission is really interested in health per se. They talk about health, but where are they? They don't seem to be doing anything about it. And this has been my experience in dealing with the nuclear industry in Canada. It's rather frustrating, because when you look at the legislation that creates the Nuclear Safety Commission, One of the only reasons why this commission exists is the health and safety of people and the environment. And yet, almost all the people on their staff are physicists and engineers, or chemists, and they have hardly anybody who's a biologist, well, they have a few, or who are medical people, and they don't have very much competence in the area of medical expertise, which really looks at human health as the priority, which it really should be. Now, I've had a lot of unfortunate incidents. I had a man named Barney Paulson who was in the news a great deal some years ago. This man was a corporal in the Air Force, and he was among 600 men who were ordered to go, military men, who were ordered to go to Chalk River to clean up after a nuclear accident in 1958. And this man had over 100 operations for cancer subsequently all over his body. And he finally came to us, and we helped him to try and get compensation for cancer, which was caused by his work at Chalk River. Now, the thing that most dismayed me about this, we had 7 hearings, and each time he was rejected, and finally he won, and we got him his compensation. But you know, in all that time, nobody from the nuclear industry, nobody from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Association even bothered to come and look at his medical records or to interview him. You'd think they would take an interest. If they're interested in protecting the health of humans, you would think that they would at least take an interest to come and look and see whether that damage perhaps was caused by radiation, and maybe they could learn something from it. But you know what? The impression that we've got consistently is they'd rather not know. They'd really rather not know. Don't bother us with that. We'll just do our best to try and prevent it from happening again, but we don't even want to know what it is. So I find that attitude is reprehensible, because I think it leads to the situation which we're at today, where if you look at the transcripts of the public meeting on November 27th, which I read, there's hardly one word spoken. There isn't a single word spoken, I don't think, by the commission staff, unless they're pushed by citizens having to do with health or having to do with the safety of people. What they're talking about is equipment and processes and numbers. They're not talking about health. And I think that's unfortunate. Well, here's what I would like to suggest. I would like to suggest that you consider these 2 possibilities. Number 1 is status quo, but not really status quo. Let's let the nuclear industry take us on a different ride, which is towards these advanced fuel cycles. And if they're going to create a new facility here to manufacture slightly enriched uranium, then why should they not use another facility on the same site to produce these other fuels that they're going to be producing in the future? In other words, this is the start of something new. All right? Another scenario, however, is this. Maybe now's the time to say, look, why don't you take it elsewhere? Why don't you take it out of town and do it somewhere else? Why don't you get it away from the water? They say that water is the worst thing for criticality accidents, because unless this stuff gets wet, it's not going to undergo a criticality. So why not get it away from the waterfront, away from the water, get it away from the people because of the toxicity, get it away from the transportation routes and the traffic because of the security problem. Why not put it somewhere where you can look after these problems in a more isolated, more secure environment, where it's not going to impinge upon people? And people can keep their jobs. They can commute to work. It's not, I mean, people commute to work all the time. It's not a question of losing jobs necessarily. It's just a question of getting it the heck out of downtown Port Hope. So, but you know what? It's not going to happen by itself. It's very convenient to have buildings sitting there unoccupied, empty, ready to be used for this purpose. And if you're willing to just sort of sit there and let it happen, I'm sure that's exactly what's going to happen. So I think it's a time of decision for people in Port Hope, and I don't think it's a question of whether you're pro-nuclear or anti-nuclear. I think it's a question of what's best for the town. I think it's a question of what's best for the future of Port Hope. It's a lovely town. I haven't been here. I've only been here on 2 previous occasions, once in '75 when that horrible contamination thing was happening, and another time when El Dorado was trying to build a new refinery, a trioxide refinery out in Hope Township. And by the way, they got turned down because of the, you know, if they tried to put this facility into a new location, can you imagine the difficulties they would have? Can you imagine what would happen if they went to another town, Coburg, say, and said, we're going to put it in your downtown? Can you imagine? So, you know, I think you have to realize that they're having it very easy here. They're just saying, hey, this is a piece of cake. We can just take one of these old buildings and just fix it up and use it for this space-age technology and pretend that it's just nothing different from what we've been doing all along. So I think that that's the end of my comments for right now, and I'll be glad to answer any of your questions, including any questions you might have about enrichment later on. Thank you very much. The nuclear industry is very much in need of getting some new sales. They basically said, let's kiss natural uranium goodbye. We've got to go to what's called advanced fuel cycles. Advanced fuel cycles start with what's called SEU, slightly enriched uranium, but that's only the beginning. Slightly enriched uranium is one example of an advanced fuel cycle. Port Hope has one of the few plants in the world that can do this uranium conversion work. There's only 4 in North America. And this is the only one that is situated so close to a downtown area. In most other cases, you know, they are isolated. They have a very large exclusion zone around them where people are not allowed to live or to go. Now they want to bite the bullet and they want to start using slightly enriched uranium. And that's just the beginning, because it means that they're now launching into what's called advanced fuel cycles. In a few years' time, they may be making fuels from plutonium. If they had their way. That is, if they're able to sell some reactors and get some business going. Already they're testing a plutonium fuel bundle up at Chalk River. It's been tested there already for 3 years. And once those tests are finished, which is just about now, by the way, they're going to be making a pitch to try and go ahead and start using plutonium as a fuel. Well, to Port Hope, it means that you are on the cutting edge as well. These fuels are different. Natural uranium fuels do have their dangers. Once you start using these advanced fuel cycles, the trouble is you have new problems. First of all, the fuels themselves are much more toxic. For example, even slightly enriched uranium, they're talking about importing 5% uranium as a feedstock and then blending it down to about 1%. Enriched uranium is something you have to import because here in Canada we do not have the ability to enrich uranium. So we're talking about importing uranium from other countries, which has been enriched. It might have come from Canada originally, but it has to go somewhere else to be enriched. Then it would come back here. When it comes back here, it's at least 3 to 5 times more radiotoxic than the natural uranium. That means that whatever emissions come out of the plant are more toxic. The second thing is that you have the possibility of accidents which did not exist before, and these are called criticality accidents. Criticality has to do with the fact that when the uranium is enriched, then if you have enough of this stuff and it gets wet and it's in a bad geometry, as they call it, then it can undergo a spontaneous nuclear reaction without even having a nuclear reactor. With slightly enriched uranium, the risk is very slight. But as you step up the chain towards using plutonium and so on, the risk gets much greater. The third thing is physical security. You have to start worrying about terrorists, you have to start worrying about sabotage, you have to start worrying about malicious acts. I'm not saying that this is going to be the case with the slightly enriched uranium project itself, but once you start embarking on those advanced fuel cycles, that's the direction you're moving in. Increased security is a major concern in the environmental assessment for this SEU project. Maybe now's the time to say, look, why don't you take it elsewhere? Why don't you get it away from the water? They say that water is the worst thing for criticality accidents. Get it away from the people because of the toxicity. Get it away from the transportation routes and the traffic because of the security problem. Why not put it somewhere where you can look after these problems in a more isolated, more secure environment? People can keep their jobs, they can commute to work. It's not a question of losing jobs necessarily, it's just a question of getting it the heck out of downtown Port Hope. This really is a major turning point. The fact is, these Bruce reactors have run on natural uranium from the day they were built. They don't need SEU. What they're really planning on is starting these advanced fuel cycles. It's not so much for the Bruce power plant, it's for a new generation of reactors which is going to use advanced fuels and which will not be able to run on natural uranium. And what they're hoping to do, as they always do, is to just get it incrementally in place before anybody catches on. But if you're going to be doing this much more dangerous type of operation, not that this one isn't, but this one would be far more, then move it out. Move it out. Don't do it here. We don't want it here. And I think that that's a real option. It's a political decision that has to be taken by the people of Port Hope. Do we politically want this or do we not? It's not a question for the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission to decide. It's not a question for Cameco to decide. It's something for the people of Port Hope to decide. This might be a historic development. Amicably, Cameco can be told, look, you want to get into this stuff, put it somewhere else. Let's phase out this waterfront property here and start planning for the future. If you're really planning for the future, then let's really plan for the future, and let's do it on a site which is more appropriate. I could imagine the property values in this town would go way up if you could repossess the waterfront. If the money's there right now to do cleanups, then why on earth would you want to continue the problem? I was quite startled when reading the minutes, the transcript of the meeting of November 27th in Ottawa, that there is no exclusion zone whatsoever. None. In fact, they had an exclusion zone written into the document, and they announced at the meeting that that was scrapped, take it out, omit it. Much to my astonishment, no, there isn't any exclusion zone for this SEU project. This is a pie-in-the-sky scheme. They don't have any sales for these new reactors. They're hoping against hope, and they're going to be able to sell these advanced CANDU reactors. They're trying to sell them in the States. But they don't have any customers. So all of this SEU is being done on spec. It's really not necessary at all for the current existing reactors. It's not at all necessary for the Bruce plant. It's something that they think that they might be able to turn a profit later on, maybe. And if not, well, surely the taxpayer will pay the cost.
Port Hope has been called upon to make itself the national sacrifice zone for Canada on the issue of nuclear power. If I were from Port Hope, what I would be asking for is a full environmental assessment and a hearing, a public hearing, that gives the people who live in that area the right to question and cross-examine the scientists and the so-called experts who draft the conclusions of that report, so that there's a full assessment of the cost that this is going to impose upon the public, including the health costs and the economic costs. Every child in Port Hope has the right to go down to that waterfront, to use the beaches, and to pull a fish out of the waterway and bring it home and feed it to the families with the security that they're not going to cause injury. That right has been stolen from the people of Port Hope. You know, the message is really simple and fundamental. Don't buy a pig in a poke. Don't make a deal where you don't know what the costs are. Make a good bargain for the people of your community, and you'll never know what a good bargain is until you know the true costs and the true benefits of licensing this facility in your area, and you will never know that until you have a full environmental impact assessment and a public hearing. The costs of pollution-based prosperity fall upon the children of the town and the public trust assets and the people who live there, and they also ought to know the true cost.